72 hours before everything ended, Yu Menglong was still alive to the world. Not alive in headlines or rumors or official statements, but alive in something far more unsettling when viewed in retrospect. Routine. He answered messages. He followed schedules. He moved through his days with the precision expected of someone whose life had long been governed by structure. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. Nothing appeared urgent. Nothing appeared final. That is precisely what makes those final 72 hours so disturbing. There was no visible rupture, no public farewell, no dramatic gesture that could later be identified as a warning sign, no moment that allowed observers to say, with certainty, that something irreversible was approaching. Everything unfolded within a carefully maintained normality, one that had defined much of his professional existence, a normality that functioned less as comfort and more as containment. In the early hours of that timeline, Yu Menglong was not entirely isolated. There were brief exchanges, functional conversations, communications that neither revealed distress nor expressed alarm, nothing that, on its own, would justify the ending that would follow. Yet even then, something was already misaligned, not visibly broken, but subtly displaced. Those who study these cases often search for obvious signs, emotional outbursts, drastic changes, public crises, but in environments built on control, collapse rarely announces itself through chaos. It arrives through silence, through restraint, through the gradual disappearance of agency. During those 72 hours, Yu Menglong did not fully control his own schedule. Decisions passed through external filters. Time was allocated, movements were defined, presences were approved, absences were imposed. His days followed a logic that was not entirely his own. Approximately 48 hours before the end, small behavioral shifts began to emerge. Responses became shorter. Initiative faded from conversations he once navigated with ease. His presence remained compliant but no longer expansive. None of this was enough to raise alarms. In an industry where exhaustion is normalized, such changes are often dismissed as the silent cost of success, a form of wear that is acknowledged privately but never examined publicly. Only later, when the timeline was revisited, did those details acquire weight. In the final 48 hours, Yu Menglong continued to comply. There was no visible conflict with the structure around him, no attempt to break away, no public confrontation. Everything remained within expected boundaries. And that is precisely why the ending became so difficult to comprehend. There were people who spoke with him, people who were with him, people whose proximity later vanished from the official narrative, not because they were accused of wrongdoing, but because their presence complicated a simplified story. Official accounts rarely linger on such details. They do not identify who last saw him alive. They do not explain who made certain practical decisions. They do not clarify why some hours remain blurred, unreconstructed, suspended without explanation. Those hours matter. In any investigation, the final 24 hours are the core of truth. They are where decisions, pressures, silences, and consequences converge. Yet from the beginning, time itself was treated not as an ally of understanding, but as an inconvenience. And when time is managed that way, what disappears first is not information, but meaning. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when everything breaks down, but when nothing appears to be wrong. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that our future investigations can continue to illuminate the truths that often remain hidden behind the entertainment industry's brightest lights. Share this video across every platform where voices gather, because collective awareness is the only force capable of demanding accountability. Let us stand together, not in anger, but in clarity and compassion, to ensure that what happened to Yu Menglong is never repeated. Let us raise our voices so that silence can no longer swallow the struggles of those who give so much of themselves to the world. 48 hours before the end, nothing appeared broken. There were no public warning signs, no visible conflict, no cancelled commitments or emotional displays that could later be isolated as proof that something was wrong. Yu Menglong continued to move through his days inside the same narrow corridor that had defined his professional life for years. Messages were answered, schedules were respected, obligations were fulfilled with precision. From the outside, this continuity suggested stability. Inside the system, It was interpreted as control functioning exactly as intended. Communication during this period did not stop. It thinned. Responses arrived promptly, but they carried less depth. Fewer words, less texture. Conversations that once allowed room for nuance were reduced to their most functional form. What mattered was execution, not expression. Completion, not reflection. This kind of shift rarely raises concern in highly regulated environments. Exhaustion is normalized. Emotional withdrawal is reframed as focus. Silence is interpreted as professionalism. When Yu Menglong spoke less, no one paused to ask why. When he stopped expanding on ideas, it was not read as disengagement, but efficiency. In an industry that rewards endurance over interior clarity, this pattern is not unusual. Compliance had long been mistaken for well-being. What makes these 48 hours unsettling in retrospect is not what occurred, but what did not. There were no arguments, no attempts to renegotiate commitments, no visible resistance to the structure that governed his days. Everything unfolded exactly as expected, and that absence of friction suggests something more troubling than conflict ever could. It suggests that resistance may no longer have felt possible. During this period, Yu Menglong did not fully control his own time. His agenda passed through external filters. Decisions were shaped elsewhere before reaching him. Movements were defined in advance. Interactions were mediated. Even moments designated for rest existed within parameters established by others. What appeared orderly from the outside functioned internally as containment. Control did not need to announce itself. It was embedded in routine. Several individuals interacted with him during these hours. Some were collaborators. Some were intermediaries. Some were part of the operational structure that managed his daily life. Their presence is never explicitly denied in official narratives, but it is never clearly described either. They appear briefly in fragmented references, then fade from the public record. Official accounts do not identify who last spoke to him. They do not clarify who approved final decisions. They do not explain why certain hours remain unaccounted for. Instead, the story is presented as a conclusion without a process, a result without a chronology. By removing the sequence, the narrative removes the framework that would allow questions to be asked. When the timeline is examined closely, a pattern emerges. As the hours advance, margins disappear. Flexibility narrows. Privacy becomes conditional. Even recovery is scheduled. There is no space to disappear for a few hours. No opportunity to disconnect without explanation. No silence that is not already accounted for. Fragments of message exchanges from this period, according to partial and indirect accounts, reveal a tone that is strikingly neutral, almost mechanical. There is no explicit despair, no language of farewell, no phrasing that could later be cited as a warning sign. And paradoxically, that absence becomes one of the most unsettling elements of all. Because in systems built on control, crises do not always express themselves through words. They express themselves through erosion, through the gradual reduction of personal voice, through the quiet acceptance of decisions made elsewhere, through the internalization of limits so complete that they no longer feel imposed. When speaking no longer changes outcomes, silence becomes inevitable. To an external observer, Yu Menglong appeared calm, composed, functional. He was present, responsive, compliant. There was no visible deviation from expectation. Yet presence does not equal agency. Responsiveness does not equal freedom. Compliance does not equal consent. These distinctions matter. In the final 48 hours, Yu Menglong did not step outside the system that had shaped his life. He did not confront it. He did not visibly challenge it. He continued to operate within its boundaries, fulfilling what was required of him. And it is precisely this continuity that complicates the narrative of an unexpected ending. Because when everything appears normal, the system absolves itself. Normality becomes a shield. Routine becomes evidence. Stability becomes an argument against scrutiny. The absence of visible disruption is used to suggest that nothing could have been wrong. Yet, in reality, the most controlled environments often produce the quietest collapses. There is a reason why investigators pay close attention to periods where nothing seems to happen, because that is where pressure accumulates without release, where autonomy contracts invisibly, where individuals learn over time that deviation is not an option, where endurance replaces expression, where silence becomes the safest response. In those 48 hours, Yu Menglong did not disappear. He did not withdraw completely. He remained present within the framework that defined him. But presence, under constant regulation, can become its own form of erasure. By the time the final day approached, the structure around him had already done its work. The corridor had narrowed. The margins had vanished. The voice had softened to near silence. Nothing looked wrong. And that was the problem. As the timeline crossed into the final 24 hours, coherence began to fracture. Up to that point, everything had followed a recognizable pattern. Controlled, regulated, predictable. But in the last day, time itself started to behave differently. Some moments remained sharply defined, recorded with precision. Others blurred, thinned, and then vanished from the public account entirely. The narrative no longer flowed. It jumped. Official descriptions moved quickly from one point to another, bypassing the spaces in between. Those spaces were never described as empty, only as unnecessary to explain. And yet, in any serious examination, it is precisely those intervals that matter most. They are where pressure accumulates. They are where decisions are absorbed rather than contested. They are where silence becomes structural. During these final 24 hours, Yu Menglong was not completely alone, but neither was he autonomous. He remained within the same framework that had governed his life for years. His movements occurred inside predefined boundaries. His interactions were limited. His access to unmediated space was conditional. Supervision did not need to be constant to be effective. The structure itself performed that function. What becomes increasingly difficult to ignore at this stage is the central contradiction that was never addressed publicly. If the environment was so tightly regulated, how did the ending occur without intervention? If every variable was managed, how did the most critical moment go unnoticed until it was irreversible? Official explanations never resolved this tension. Instead, they avoided it. There was no detailed discussion of emotional care protocols, no acknowledgement of cumulative psychological strain, no examination of the long-term effects of sustained control. The final day was treated as an isolated event, detached from its context, framed as something sudden rather than something shaped over time. Communication during these hours narrowed to its most basic form. Messages were minimal. Exchanges were strictly functional. There was no room for extended dialogue, no space for reflection, no visible effort to slow the process down. Everything moved forward as planned. No external alerts were raised. No independent intervention occurred. No deviation from the established structure was visible. From the outside, this appeared orderly. From an investigative perspective, it appeared sealed. When the announcement finally came, it arrived with notable speed. The first official statement was released quickly, almost immediately after the outcome became public. Its language was impersonal, neutral, carefully constructed. There was no acknowledgement of uncertainty, no indication that unanswered questions remained. The message did not attempt to explain what had happened in the preceding hours. It simply stated that it had ended. The request that followed was familiar. Respect, privacy, silence. Within that request, the narrative closed. Once a story is presented as definitive, the frame shifts. Questions are no longer neutral. They become intrusive. Doubt is reframed as disrespect. Analysis is dismissed as speculation. The emotional impact of the moment does the rest. Shock compresses time. Grief redirects attention. The space for scrutiny collapses. Structurally, the response was efficient. Media outlets replicated the statement. Platforms adjusted visibility. Conversations initially surged, then quickly dispersed. In parallel, certain materials began to disappear. Posts were removed. Videos stopped circulating. Keywords lost momentum. Nothing explicit, nothing traceable, but the effect was unmistakable. The story stopped expanding. The final 24 hours of Yu Menglong, which should have been reconstructed carefully, were reduced to a footnote. The focus shifted from understanding to closure, from process to outcome, from questions to acceptance. And yet, the silence did not resolve the discomfort. Because when a narrative omits its most critical segment, the human mind does not register it as complete. It registers it as unfinished, as a sequence missing its center, as a story that ends without explaining how it reached its conclusion. What remains is not accusation, but unease. Unease rooted in unanswered questions about responsibility, about pressure, about control, about what happens when a system manages not only a person's life, but also the story of its end. Because when the same structure defines both, transparency becomes impossible. The absence of a minute-by-minute reconstruction is not a technical oversight. It is a choice that prioritizes manageability over understanding, order over clarity, resolution over truth. In the final 24 hours, time was not treated as an ally of explanation. It was treated as a liability, something to be condensed, simplified, sealed. And when time is sealed along with a case, what disappears first is not speculation, but context. That is why these hours continue to resist closure, not because they prove anything hidden, but because they leave too much unexamined, because they were never allowed to exist as a story, only as an ending. When the final day is removed from the narrative, what remains is a conclusion without a path, an outcome without a process, a silence that explains nothing, but protects everything. There has never been a complete public reconstruction of the final hours of Yu Menglong. No continuous account, no verified minute-by-minute sequence that explains how routine transformed into an irreversible ending. What exists instead is a collection of fragments, isolated facts, statements that do not speak to one another. Together, they offer closure without understanding. In those last hours, time appears compressed. Some moments are documented with clinical precision. Others simply vanish, not because they did not occur, but because they were never explained. And when the subject is a public figure, that absence is not incidental. It is a decision. Those who attempted to reconstruct the final stretch encountered silence, administrative silence, contractual silence, human silence. Individuals who had been present stopped speaking, or never spoke at all, or spoke only through intermediaries. Everything filtered, everything managed. There was no official, detailed chronology, no public explanation of which protocols were activated, if any were activated at all. No clarity on who made the final decisions or under what criteria. Information circulated as conclusions, not processes. And when process is removed, accountability becomes impossible. The first official statement arrived with notable speed. Its tone was neutral, impersonal, almost technical. There was no space for ambiguity, no acknowledgement of complexity. The message was not constructed to open understanding, but to close it. Respect was requested. Privacy was invoked. Silence was encouraged. And within that appeal, the framework for everything that followed was established. Once a narrative is declared definitive, questions are reframed as violations. Doubt becomes intrusion. Analysis becomes speculation. It is a familiar mechanism, and it is effective. Emotional shock absorbs attention. Grief reorganizes priorities. The urgency to understand is replaced by the obligation to accept. Structurally, the response was efficient. The narrative consolidated quickly. Media outlets replicated the statement. Platforms adjusted visibility. Conversations dispersed. In parallel, certain materials disappeared. Posts were removed. Videos stopped circulating. Keywords lost traction. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be directly pointed to. But the effect was measurable. The subject stopped expanding. The final 72 hours of Yu Menglong, which should have been the core of serious examination, were reduced to a footnote. The emphasis shifted from comprehension to order, from inquiry to resolution, from truth to manageability. And yet, something remained unresolved. Because when a story ends abruptly, without development, without context, without answered questions, the human mind does not register it as an ending. It registers it as an interruption, as a narrative with missing pages, as something unfinished. This case continues to generate unease, not because there is visible proof of concealment, but because there is a void too large to ignore, a gap between what happened and what was explained, a gap filled not with information, but with silence. Questions remain, not accusations, but inquiries, about pressure, about control, about cumulative exhaustion, about shared responsibility, questions that do not point fingers, but refuse to disappear. Perhaps we will never know what Yu Menglong thought in those final hours. Perhaps we will never hear every conversation or see every document that could illuminate that period. But one fact remains clear: time was treated as an enemy, not as an ally of truth. The case was closed quickly, sealed, archived. And when time is sealed along with a story, what is protected is not memory, but structure. Remember these 72 hours not as certainty, but as an incomplete sequence. Because sometimes, understanding what is missing tells us more than everything that was shown.